After the extraordinary meeting of leaders in Brussels, support for Ukraine and the initiative for European defense seems to be laying squarely on the shoulders of Europe. Recently, the actions of U.S. administration officials have left more questions than answers when it comes to transatlantic relations and American reliability. Now, joining me to discuss our current position and where we are headed is Cordelia Buchanan Ponczek, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you very much for coming into the studio. It's great to see you, and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, now we were just discussing a minute ago that we do live in interesting times for the moment. But when we look at U.S. military aid to Ukraine, something that seems to be having an immediate impact at the moment is the freezing of the weapons deliveries and the intelligence sharing to Ukraine. What do you think are the main contributing factors? Is this the blow up in the White House? And when can we maybe expect these measures to be withdrawn and the resumption of military intelligence and weapons deliveries?
It's a great question. And first of all, I like the tie a lot. Very strong statement. Second of all, yes, we were talking about what crazy times we live in, and I've likened it to drinking out of a fire hose. There's a lot of water gushing out, but you feel like you're not catching very much, and the thirst is there. Last time I was in the studio, I opened by saying two things. First, that this war is still ongoing in Ukraine, and second, at the time, that military aid was still flowing. Well, one of those statements is still true, but the other one isn't true anymore. The war is still ongoing, as we have seen from Russia's incessant barrage of Ukraine over the past 24 hours, but the military aid has stopped. And not only that, but intelligence sharing has stopped. And this is really shocking. It feels like the White House is turning all the screws on the Ukrainians to bring them to the table. But as Zelensky has said time and time and time again, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. So it's beginning to feel almost cruel, horrifying to see some of these measures coming out and beginning to wonder, well, what does Ukraine need to do in order to turn the faucet back on, the faucet of military aid, the faucet of intelligence sharing? I will add, just for fairness, that today probably you have seen that Donald Trump finally did take issue with the Russians. He finally spoke out. He threatened further sanctions. He said that Russia needs to come to the table. And I think a part of that has been the statements that that Zelensky has made over the past week to say, we are ready for peace. We are ready to come to the table. We are ready to do what it takes, really moving that back to the court, the ball back to the court for the Russians to respond and return to the table as well.
Do you think that the United States has kind of folded an otherwise good hand that it was given? And I say this in that it seems like they had a bit of leverage, and that leverage seems to have disappeared at this point. Do you think that the U.S. strategy is to woo Vladimir Putin to the table in expressing all these Russian talking points and not wanting to discuss who started the war, who invaded who?
We have heard from the administration it didn't work before. You've had 3 years to do this. We have tried, making these statements, blaming Russia. It didn't work. So let's try something new. Certainly the administration has said that time and time and time again. But that's why I bring up this turning of the screws, because I think that it would be possible to perhaps take a lesser stance against Russia, but to simultaneously be so unkind to the Ukrainians has really put Zelensky in a difficult position and really made the maneuvering around the peace deal into a very large fiasco that it did not have to be.
Certainly seems that way. Now, the minerals deal is still hanging in the balance. Do you think it's in Ukraine's interest to go ahead and sign that deal, ink that deal as soon as possible? Do you think that'll please Donald Trump? And do you think that this will give the United States some skin in the game so that somewhere down the road there is this link, this bond between the United States and Ukraine that they so eagerly need?
Certainly, and I'll take a step back and a personal anecdote. I was preparing something on this minerals deal to release last Friday. So I sent it off to my editor for comments. Then I stepped out, and suddenly I'm getting all of these notifications on my phone because I thought, well, it's a done deal. Zelensky's visit to the White House is just a rubber stamp on this this deal that's already been agreed to. And then all these notifications are coming through. I think, what could possibly be going on? Well, now we know what was going on. Quite something, and obviously really shocking scenes over a deal that I do think that Ukraine is prepared to sign. I also want to say, so people have been using the deal word very, I guess, very much not with context. It's a memorandum of understanding, which means that it's not legally binding. It's a statement of intent. And what the statement of intent is essentially to establish a fund. And this would be an investment fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And so the deal, the memorandum of understanding, stipulates that as Ukraine has these assets, these natural resources that can be monetized, that 50% of the profits from the monetization of those assets, they'll be put into this fund. And then that fund is going to be used to invest reconstruction and development of Ukraine. Another really important part of this deal that I want to highlight is this is not just minerals. Surely Ukraine has critical raw materials, and we can talk about that, but it also includes oil and gas, traditional hydrocarbons, and it includes infrastructure. This is port infrastructure and LNG terminals, for example. And aside that, it doesn't include the current state-owned assets of Ukraine, so something like Naftogaz. So the way that I see this, it has really been portrayed as an exploitation of Ukraine. But Ukraine itself stated that actually it will retain full ownership of the minerals. And so I don't necessarily see it in the same exploitive way as others. It's almost like a two-country sovereign wealth fund, and we do have examples of that. The European Investment Fund would be one such example. For a singular country, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund would be an example. Places where a fund is used because of natural resources and then can take those, the money that's put into the pot and put it towards investment. It does seem to have been watered down from the initial versions that we saw that were leaked into something that's much more acceptable for Ukraine.
Right, and Donald Trump presumably won't be the president forever, so the conditions, or if something is deemed maybe a little bit unfair, it can be corrected in the future, could it not?
Presumably it could be corrected, although I must say that there are still a couple points that for me are lacking clarity, and one of those is actually the ratification of the deal. So once the memorandum of understanding is signed, presumably the Americans take it to Congress, and then the Ukrainians take it to Parliament and put it through a ratification process, and then we could see how that might play out in U.S. Congress right now, for example, and different aspects that might be raised there that would be relevant to the Trump presidency, but then also to future Republican or Democratic candidates.
Let's move on because we're almost out of time. The EU summit in Brussels, what do you think is the biggest development that you see with European leaders coming together there?
Common debt. Common debt is an incredible step forward. We saw it with COVID-19. My big talking point on the common debt is the ability, potentially, for the euro to overtake the dollar as a reserve currency. The dollar has been doing wild things because of the tariff back and forth that's been going on. Currently, the euro is about 20% of global reserve currency, and part of that's been held back because there is no common debt in the European Union. Such steps on common debt are huge takeaways for investors that would be very interested in getting a piece of that pie. Aside of that, talks on the nuclear deal, the nuclear umbrella, and then talks on how to cooperate with the United Kingdom, for example. These are huge takeaways from these summits.
Right, and 800 billion euros, that seems like a lot of money. Would your expectations be, because Europe seems like it needs to play catch up quite a bit really quick, do you think that this money will come together and be expedited in the way it's spent and spent well?
It's hard to say. I mean, the European Union has talked big before and then had problems when it came to scaling up. There's a question of how the money is going to be spent at national levels in order to help defense champions at the nation-state level. The money could also be spent in order to use abroad, either with the United States, South Korea, Israel. So these arms deals are something that could be put on the table. But how we see this at the nation level, we'll see how it plays out. It's an open question for me.
All right. Okay. All right, well, Cordelia Buchanan Ponczek, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight, but do stay tuned because Face to Face with Adam Yasser and Michał Broniatowski is coming up next. See you later.